Sweet.
Got it.
All right. So if you could just go ahead and introduce yourself and
Yeah,
take it away.
yeah, sure.
Ooh, whoops.
Little twitchy. Um, it's good to see everybody here. That's me. I'm Gary Skuse, and I'm a professor in the School of Life Sciences. Um, and I was asked to talk to you tonight about alternative careers, and I'm going to I'm going to talk about that, but I'm going to take a little more holistic approach, and I want to talk about careers in general, and then I'm going to present for you a lot of alternatives that don't involve working in a laboratory necessarily. I know that most biotech students, especially, but a lot of students in the biological sciences think that when they get their degree, they're kind of condemned to work at a lab bench for the rest of their careers. And nothing could be further from the truth. So I'm going to talk about those things. I also recognize that it's 7 p.m. on a Wednesday, and I'd rather have a chat than a lecture. So please interrupt me as often as you'd like. In fact, if we don't get past this first slide, I'm perfectly okay. So if anyone has any specific questions, like, am I qualified to be a neurosurgeon? You know, that kind of thing with your bachelor's degree in biotech, we can talk about that, okay? So if anyone has any questions, please just interrupt. But what I want to, okay, so does anybody have any questions? And I cannot see everybody. I think as the host, Paul, if somebody raises their hand, you'll know it and you can sort of take care of things, and otherwise just shout out. So I want to talk about life after RIT, and this is something, and for some of you, what I'm about to say is sad, and for others of you, this is good. This is something you should be thinking about from the moment you walk on campus, and that's because you need to make some personal decisions about things like growing a network of contacts, both within the faculty, outside of RIT, among your fellow students, talking to advisors to make sure you have your ducks in a row, as they say. If you want to go to law school, for example, and use your degree to write patents, then there are certain courses that you ought to take to enhance your chances of getting into law school and things like that. Now, if you're a senior this year or a third-year student, all is not lost. I mean, there's still a lot of choices, but it's the sort of thing that you should be thinking about almost from the moment you get to RIT and throughout the time you're here. So what I want to do is give you some information. I don't want to encourage or discourage any particular path. You won't hear me say, don't do that, it's stupid. And you also won't hear me say, do this, it's the only thing you can do. I have some friends who are advisors who have very specific ideas about what's good and what's bad. And that's not my role. My role is just to provide information so that you can make your own decisions. If you have questions, I'll answer them tonight. If you have questions after the fact, just get in touch with me. I would say stop by my office, and you're always welcome to stop by my office. I'm just not there, okay? So you can stand out in the hall and, you know, regret walking there. Anyway, so I just want to give you information. So I'm going to start out with some general advice that's going to be good for the rest of your life, okay? And in this, I know I sound like somebody's dad, but I've been doing this for a long time, and I've seen how things have been done right and how things have been done wrong. So I want to give you some impressions of how to do things right. And that's why I say this has no expiration date. 30 years from now, when you're in your third or fourth or fifth job or second career or whatever, these things that we're going to talk about in the next few slides will hold true. So this book, and this might be the only book I've ever recommended to anybody ever. This book is good because it talks about networking. And some people will joke that bench scientists, like most of us, are socially maladapted and we don't know how to talk to people and we're introverts. That's why we stand at a lab bench all day. And this book is about how scientists can network with other scientists. And it has some really, really good advice. And interestingly, it's written by someone who has a degree in physics, but she's obviously a writer. She's not pursuing her career in physics. So this is what I got from it. And the very first point is huge. take every opportunity you can to get to know people. It's true, and this is a fact, that most people get jobs because of people they know. I mean, back in the day, people say, oh, gee, my Uncle Fred will get me a job somewhere. And that may have been true, but today that counts. So if you have a relative or a friend, and I'm going to tell you about a student of mine whose friend's mom was in a good position to help him. Network. And there's some advice I'll give you about that in the next couple of slides. But do it everywhere. Do it at RIT. Being members of the Biotech Club is an opportunity to network, not only amongst yourselves, because 10 years from now, you're all going to be a professional in some position, and knowing each other will help. Even if it's just for advice, like, I want to do what you do. What do I need to do to get there? That kind of thing. And you should do it locally. You should do it at professional meetings, volunteer positions, your church. I mean, anything. You should always be on your best behavior, and you should always be introducing yourself and making positive impressions on people. None of you have had me in a face-to-face class. I don't think.
I have.
Thomas has, of course you have. See, now I can't see. Now you're just a silhouette. But
Yeah, it's starting to rain, so I'm running inside.
okay, we'll look at the inside of your pocket while you do it. I tend to tell anecdotes because I try to learn from things that I've experienced in my life. And I say in positions at church, whatever, I've done multiple things outside of RIT that are way outside of biotechnology, way outside of bioinformatics, way outside of science. And I can't count the times that I've made good impressions on people and they've helped me in the future. The story I was going to tell is I was teaching a lab. I mentioned a few minutes ago that I love labs because I get to know my students. You know, while a gel is running or something's incubating, we chat. And at the end of a semester, the student said to me the most valuable thing that I told him all semester, and I guess I could be a little mad about this, but he said the most valuable thing I told him is, I said, if you want people to remember you, you don't need to have face tattoos or piercings or anything like that. You need to be nice. And if you're kind to people, they will remember you, guaranteed. So when I meet people in the community outside of my field, just nice to them. And that doesn't mean I have to buy them coffee or anything. Just treat them with respect, treat them politely. If they ever talk about their family or something personal, remember that. And the next time you see them, say, hey, last time your son was sick, how's he doing? They love that. People love that. So network every place you can. Establish your brand. And now this is something that was in the book, and I'm a big believer in that. Distribute business cards that describe you. So even as undergraduates, you could say, biotech major, you know, seeking position is this. Business cards from Vistaprint, you can get 500 for $10. You should, every time you have a networking opportunity, you should have a pocket full of them, and you should pass them out liberally. I had students in bioinformatics, students are required to do co-ops, and we went to a meeting, a professional meeting, and my students brought business cards, and I swear every person they met, when a student, you know, a 20-year-old student handed a professional a business card, they all lit up. They went, ooh, you guys are slick. Okay, so this came out of that book, and I agree with it 100%. Seek opportunities to network. So you can write something for newsletters or blogs. As you get more advanced in your career, like me, I review manuscripts for journals. I review grant applications. If you're associated with a faculty member right now, if you're doing research, tell that person, hey, if you get a manuscript review, can I help? Can I see it? Can I see it before you review it and after to see what you did? Start getting experience doing stuff like that, because someday you're going to be doing it on your own. Volunteer in an office or a laboratory. I've done a lot of work with pre-medical students, and almost all of them shadow a clinician. Well, you can shadow a laboratorian, which is kind of one of my favorite words. If you find yourself, you want to be a journalist, you want to write for science publications, find an opportunity to work in a journal office. There's actually one in Rochester that does scientific stuff. You could work there. You're a volunteer there. Volunteer in community groups. Like I said, I met people outside of my field who have helped me with all sorts of things over the years. Sit on committees. Do that within RIT and outside. Demonstrate leadership abilities when you can. Become the club president or the treasurer or the vice president. And yeah, I know. And at this point in your development as professionals, you don't have a whole lot on your resume. So stuff like that does count. When you hand someone a resume and you've kept it to the one page you were incorrectly advised to do, having volunteer positions and leadership positions are going to stand out and make you distinctive. So look at your real skill set. And I made myself a note here, UCSD Biomedical Science. I'll talk about that in one sec. And always act professionally. Always, 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 because it's a small world and it'll come back and bite you in the butt. And I'll tell you a story about that. But first, let me tell you about UCSD. So a number of years ago, one of our former students, she got her BS and MS with us and got her PhD at UC San Diego. While she was there, she phoned me and said, we're having a retreat in Palm Springs. Can you join us? And I said, oh yeah, of course, right? She's my favorite student. They put my wife and I up in this $600 a night casita that I couldn't afford to clean the place. And they put us up in it for 3 nights. But anyway, so because I was there and they were essentially supporting me, I was there to talk about alternative careers, and I felt obligated at lunch and dinner to work the room. I was going to sit, they had 130 students, and I was going to talk to every one of them. And I asked them, oh, what are you going to do with your degree? And, I don't know, I'm going to do a postdoc, maybe go into industry, whatever. And one student said to me that he learned that the analytical skills and the project management skills that he acquired while earning his PhD will serve him well no matter what he decides to do. And I just said, I have no advice for you whatsoever. That's absolutely true. And that's the key to some of the messages I want to get across tonight. Even though you're biotech majors, you're learning skills that translate to other fields. Your analytical skills, your organizational skills, your project management skills, whether you know it or not, you're learning those. And if you took an inventory of what you can really do, you can do accurate pipetting, right? I mean, that sounds silly, but you can do things with precision. You can do things reproducibly. You can do things analytically. You can manage projects. I mean, just going to school, you've got 4 or 5 classes, you're doing research, you're doing this, you're doing that. You have to manage it. Take an inventory of that. And then when someone says, I've known people in business who are as blunt as can be. And I'll say, hi, my name's Gary. And they go, so what's your skill set? What do you do? Where's your value? I mean, just like that. And I had already thought about it. So I was able to tell them stuff. Okay. So think about that. And then always act professionally. It's a very small world. And I, just one very, very quick anecdote. When I had a PhD student who was in her 4th or 5th year, and she talked at an international meeting in somewhere in Canada, maybe Quebec. And a more advanced scientist berated her to the point of tears, told her she was stupid, she should never get a degree. I mean, really berated her. Really, I can't imagine why the idiot did that, okay? Fast forward about 2 years, I was the chair of a grant review committee for the Department of Defense. And when we're all done awarding grants, we had some money left, a couple $100,000 left over. And someone said, hey, there's this guy. He's a really good scientist. We should give him the $200K. And it was that guy. So berating my graduate student cost him $200,000. And it's not that I'm a jerk. Well, I am, but he was a bigger jerk. And that acting unprofessionally cost him $200,000. I wrote a 4-page justification about how it wasn't fair to give him the money because other people applied for it and it was a competitive process and blah, blah, blah. But he didn't get it because he treated my student poorly. So always act professionally because you never know. Okay. All right. I've been lecturing. Ask me a question.
I have kind of an anecdote.
Please.
I was at a conference in New York City, and one of the people there were talking about, it's echoing a little bit.
Yeah, it is.
I just have someone else right next to me who's also on the Zoom call,
so that's what it is. So whatever they did, they fixed it. It's not echoing.
Yeah, they turned down the volume.
Okay. It had a godlike presence, so it was kind of cool.
But we were just going around doing introductions, and there was these two people from the bio design competition.
Yeah.
It's a thing that has like international recognition. They're just working with like scientists and artists, pretty cool
Mhm.
people. I looked them up, and I approached them later on, and I asked them like how to get involved, and it turned out that they had already come into contact with someone at RIT within the industrial design program.
Yep.
So
Yep.
like I went through the channels, I sent out the emails, and now it actually has a whole bunch of momentum. So like we might be
So,
getting a biodesign challenge / course at
so
RIT.
that was a networking opportunity that you took advantage of and it worked. More times than not, they will. Maybe not immediately, but they will. I've run into people that I don't even remember. And they'll say to me, remember 5 years ago I had trouble with something and you helped me? And I'm like, nope. And they go, well, I really appreciated that. So how about I do this for you? So honestly, that's a good story because almost 100% of the time it'll help. It'll work out. It'll give you some benefit. Anybody else have any questions? Everybody's quiet. Okay, Zach, it was good that you moved your head. I was afraid you were sleeping with your eyes open, so glad you moved your head. All right. So I just wanted to show you this. So I say right here, establish your brand, distribute business cards to describe you. For the work that I do outside of RIT, this is from my own personal business card. And when I hand this to someone, if I said professor of biological sciences, that doesn't say a thing. Am I an environmental scientist? Am I a bioinformatician? What am I? But I actually tell them what I do. And all of this stuff that I list there, I actually get paid to do through various connections. So this is all true. And if someone said communications, what the heck? I can give them a reference, work I've done for other people. So something like this is what my business card says along with contact information and stuff. And when I hand that to someone, there's no question about what I can do and it'll help identify potential ways we can work together if the opportunity arises. And then here's another lesson. So that other book I thought was really useful. You don't have to read this book. You just have to read the cover. This is really important. This is written by this guy, Robert Sutton, is a Stanford business professor. And this book is all about don't act like someone that other people don't want to work with, and don't hire someone that you don't think you can work with because it'll end up being ugly. And he says, don't be one of these. So this, I think, is really, really important. I have had opportunities, and I'm going to be honest with you. I shouldn't be because this is being recorded. No, I'll be honest with you. I've had students, and they ask me for recommendations, and I'll tell them, you really shouldn't ask me. I don't know you well enough, or I don't think I can write a positive one. And they go, well, I'm hard up. I need one. And then I'll talk to potential employers, and they'll ask me the obvious question: would you hire this student? And I got to be completely honest. And there are times where I've said, no, I wouldn't. We just don't get along. He does stuff that rubs me the wrong way. He's one of these. And I just, because what I cannot do in my position is lie to a potential employer and say, yeah, this kid is phenomenal. You're going to do great if you hire him, and then have it fall through. They'll never trust me again. So I have to be honest. So be good and be nice. And when you're building your network, do it in a positive way. If you're a jerk, people are going to remember it, and it's going to come back, and it's not going to be helpful. It's not going to be helpful. It's not like you're going to lose a job you already have. I'm not going to phone someone and say, man, you really made a mistake hiring this guy. Never, ever would I do that. But if someone asks me flat out, would you hire this person? And if I don't think I would, I'm going to be honest. So don't be a jerk. And I'm paraphrasing only because we're recording this. You can all read.
So I actually have a question.
Yeah.
Is it appropriate to ask someone if they would hire you, like for those types of situations? Like if I am asking you, like, oh, would you be able to write me a good recommendation?
It's absolutely, it is. In fact, so a lot of people don't ask that question, but I kind of hear it when they say, would you write me a letter? So one of the mistakes that way too many students make is they spend all their time doing all the things you got to do to be successful at RIT. You get good grades, you know, you take the right classes, you do everything right, but you don't take the time to network. And I'll have students come to me and say, okay, I'm going to be a senior next year. I've got a 4.0 GPA. I've earned enough credits to graduate. But we've never talked before. Could you write me a letter of recommendation? I'm like, you know, all I can say is you got an A in my class. I can't say anything beyond that. That's not a good letter. And generally speaking, letters that are brief are considered negative. You know, that old saying, if you don't have anything good to say, don't say anything. So if I write a 1-paragraph letter for somebody, the person reading that is going to look at it and say, you know, this is crap. So again, it gets back to networking. But your job then is exactly what you said. If you were to ask me for a letter of recommendation, you should say, I need a letter of recommendation for my application to something. Do you feel you could write a good one? And I'll be honest, say yes or no, right? The students that I know, I write really good letters. I spent a lot of time doing them. I've had people call me and say, I can't believe this letter you wrote for so-and-so. This is really positive. But I can do that because I know them and I have confidence in them. If I only met them in a class and you earned a good grade, big deal. You know, I can't say anything. So yes, it's absolutely appropriate to say, could you write me a good letter of recommendation? And if not, learn from it and say, oh shoot, I should have sown those seeds a long time ago. That's why I said the moment you walk on RIT's campus, start to get to know people. It's funny, I tell students that you should always go to office hours, even if it's just to stop in and say hi, because at the end of the semester, if I have a student who's on the threshold between 2 different grades, I will give a student who has demonstrated an interest in the course the benefit of the doubt and raise their grade. And if I've never met the student before, it's like, I have no reason to do anything, so I leave it on the lower end of things. I told my daughter that, again, I said earlier, I sound like somebody's dad. I told my daughter that. She was a business major at RIT. And one point, like her second or third year, she goes, you know, it's true. And I said, yeah, no, of course I know it's true. That's why I've been telling you that. So get to know faculty, even if it's just going to their office hours and, you know, do the equivalent nowadays of shaking a hand and just saying, hi, you know, I want to get to know you. I really like your class and blah, blah, blah. Okay. So this kid, this happened to be a male student, came to me and said, I want to do something or other. And my buddy's mom works at an Ivy League school doing exactly what I want to do. What should I do? I said, get in touch. He said, well, is that legit? Of course it's legit. You send a short email. No one wants to read 3 pages. You send her a short email and say, hey, can we talk on the phone briefly? I want to pick your brains about something. And if she says yes, then you write back and say, you know, this is what I expect to talk about during our phone call. Here's my CV or my resume. I want to chat about career opportunities. And then when it's done, send a handwritten thank you note. I have every thank you note I've ever received in my career. It's a stack about this high, and every one of them means something to me, and every one that she receives will mean something to her. I promise. I gave a talk a couple of years ago at a statewide meeting of attorneys, and afterwards, the head of the they have hundreds and hundreds of members. The head of the organization sent me a handwritten thank you note. And I wrote to her and said, I cannot tell you how much that means. It's more valuable than an email. It's just, and she said, I learned that a long time ago. That's why I'm the head of the organization. Okay. So handwritten, it doesn't have to be verbose. Thanks for taking the time to talk to me. I really appreciate your advice. I know your time is valuable, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So do that. And if this kid, and actually he did, and I suspect she still remembers his name because he did it right. And you notice I also say send your business card, because your business card not only has your contact information, so if something comes up in the future, she's going to say, who was that guy I talked to last spring? Oh yeah, let me give him a call, see if he's still looking for a job. So very important. All right, more questions.
Yeah, so we actually have one in the chat.
Yeah.
So she is asking, do you have any tips about how to approach professors about their research?
Yeah, oh my God,
if I'm
yes.
interested. but I personally don't know them beforehand.
Yep. So I got to say, and I hate to sound like a jerk, that I must have heard that question thousands of times in my career. And the answer you're not going to like, the answer is knock on their door and go see them and say, if you go to their RIT website, it might have their office hours listed. I swear no one comes to my office hours, so I promise you that I'm free if you want to chat. So
Oh, did he freeze for everyone?
and I like what you're doing. Can we talk about it? And no one's going to say no. They're going to say, ooh, can you hear me okay?
We can now.
Was it funny? Was it weird?
It stopped for a second.
All right, I got a little note. All right, what I said is go talk to the faculty you're interested in. Say, hey, I'm interested in doing research with you. Can we talk about it? They may say, no, I have too many people in my lab, but a couple are going to graduate in the spring. Let's talk again next year. But no one's going to say, no, leave me alone. Okay, so don't be afraid. And also, and it's the same with letters of recommendation, you're not asking for a favor. This is my job. So if you want me to write a letter of recommendation, ask, and don't feel like, could you do me a favor and write this? Or could you do me a favor and give me an opportunity to do research? That's why we're here, okay? So don't ever feel funny about that. So did I address the question that was left in chat? Okay, I'm gonna hope I did. All right, always act professionally. And this is the sort of thing that, again, you can be unprofessional in email, you can be unprofessional in social media. There are companies that archive Facebook, and then when you go to look for a job, if you apply at a company, they will pay to access that archive to look you up and see that picture of you, throwing up on your 18th birthday because you drank too much. Stop doing that. Well, stop drinking too much and puking, because honestly, it's a buzzkill. But be careful what you do. And avoid making mistakes in self-documenting media like email. I had a student a few years ago who was really mad at one of her professors and wrote a really nasty email. And the professor called me and said, you got to do something about this student. I said, I really don't. You do. It's your class, your responsibility. And well, I'm not going to tell you all the details. I was convinced the student was right. But I went and talked to the student. I said, if you're going to say something bad to someone, don't do it in email, because it's documented and it persists forever. And she said, I know, my mom works at IBM. She's the vice president for email retention. She said, I know exactly what I was doing. She wanted that professor to see that over and over again so she could realize how mad the student was. But don't do that. If you really have to write something nasty, write it, get it off your chest, don't send it. And even if that means turn off Wi-Fi in your laptop so you don't accidentally reflexively hit send, write it, call the person a jerk, use 4-letter words, do anything you want, and then hit delete. And you will feel better afterwards. If you accidentally hit send, you're never going to feel better again, because it's going to come back and bite you. Okay? So,
although Gmail does have a undo send feature.
And so does Outlook. And I love it. I'll get an email that's, someone will say something they shouldn't, and then I'll get something that says, so-and-so retracted that email. It's too late. You can't unring a bell. As soon as people see it or hear it, it's over. So you're absolutely correct. And I think that was Thomas. You're absolutely correct about that. And Outlook can do the same thing. It just doesn't work. Okay. Because you're dealing with humans. Oh, he called me a jerk. Oh, I'll forget it. Okay. Never mind. He told me to forget what he said. I'll tell you a little more about that student with the professor. It was an older female professor, and the student called her a bitter old bag. And the professor called me and said, does she know who she's talking to? I've written 2 books and I've traveled around the country on book tours. And when I told my wife that, she goes, well, kind of sounds like she's a bitter old bag. I think what the student said was probably true, but don't do it. I mean, it's not going to help anybody. So this is something nobody ever talks about. Okay. No one ever says, I hear all the time, I want to get a PhD so I can do research. Yeah. you know how much that's going to cost? Or do you know how much you're going to make? And they're, oh, no, I just want to do it. Which is kind of okay. But all of us have or are going to have responsibilities in life. I have, mortgage, car payments. I put my kids through college. Income was important. And I absolutely love my job. But if tomorrow I got an email that said RIT is not going to pay me anymore, you're not going to see me again. I mean, we work to get paid, and we work to get paid so we can do things in life, whatever that is. It doesn't matter. So you should always think about how much you're going to get paid. And you should be thinking about how much you can get. And those rules of thumb are true kind of no matter what. There's going to be a difference in academia and industry. So if you wanted to get a job as a lab technician at the U of R, for example, or at a company, you're going to make at least 20% more at the company right out of the gate. And that's just almost always true. Salaries vary by geographic location. You're going to pay more in New York City than you do in Rochester. Boston, or the Boston area. Cambridge is a little weird. Because of Harvard and MIT, they feel that you're darn lucky to have a job, so you should accept whatever they pay you. That's true in faculty positions as well. Harvard tends to pay less than everybody else. So notice the catch-22. You get paid more in New York City, but the cost of living is higher. Okay. So you got to do the math, and we'll get to that. Experience is extremely valuable. So your second job is going to pay a lot more than your first. And students don't like to hear that. It's like, oh my gosh, I put all this money, I invested so much money in my education, and I'm at RIT for 4 years, and it cost me a bloody fortune. The next 2 years that you gain experience in the workplace are going to be more valuable than your degree. Now, you have to have your degree to get the job, but that experience is valuable. The only time to negotiate pay is when you're applying for the job. If they say, we want to hire you, we're going to pay you X, that's your opportunity to say, well, I really like to get paid 1.2X. Because 6 months into it, if you say, man, I can't pay the rent, I'm starving, they go, sorry, you shouldn't have taken the job. And that's true at every level. I mean, university presidents know that. I mean, they take a job, they negotiate the salary. At those levels, when you're getting paid $1 million a year, it's not uncommon to have an attorney or someone working, an employment attorney, helping you negotiate. But even as an entry-level lab technician, if you go in and say, this job only pays $32,500, I need to get $34,500, that's your only opportunity to do that. And then experience is going to be what's going to get you ahead in whatever career you choose. Education is important, but not as important as experience. All right, questions? So I can only see 3 of you plus me, and I need better lighting, but besides that, so there's like 17 people here. Someone must have a question. This has got to feel like a class, the way I'm lecturing. It's got to.
I'll ask one.
Yeah, please do. I saw your hand move first.
What was your first job out of PhD? Or out of school in general?
Yeah, so out of graduate school, I got a postdoc. And then I went into another postdoc. And then I got a faculty position. And things are different now. I mean, I'm happy to tell you how much money I made, but things are different now. For example, well, I'll get back to that when we talk about PhD programs. Things are way different now than they were when I did it. My first, but I won't tell you I'll tell you how much if you ask, but otherwise I won't tell you. When I applied for a mortgage for my first house, I had a faculty position at a nearby university, and my salary is pretty low. And when I asked the mortgage agent, is this going to be a problem getting a mortgage? And he said, oh, absolutely not. Because we realized that if you lost your job tomorrow, you could make that much working at McDonald's. He really said that, really like got me mad, but it's true. It was a terrible income. And but things are different now. So someone else asked something in chat, correct? Yeah, okay. How much? Jacob, you really want to know? So you can look this up. I did a postdoctoral fellowship. Well, okay. When I was in graduate school, my annual stipend was $4,300. when I got my postdoc at Harvard Medical School with a Damon Runyon Fellowship, which is probably the most prestigious postdoctoral fellowship on the planet Earth. $15,000 living in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And then my first faculty position, I got paid $20,000 with a PhD and 6 years of experience. Right, Paul? Yeah, no, but things are different now. And I'm going to tell you, it's not anything like that anymore. So Josh, I hate to say I married her just because I needed her income, or Jacob rather, but it helped. Okay. Although, you know, my wife didn't make a lot of money, but it helped. It really did. But things are different now. So you can't look at that. You can't look at what happened a long time ago. Any other questions? All right. So do the math. So this is great too. I get a student that comes to me and says, hey, I was offered a job for X number of dollars. Can I afford to take it? And I go, do the math. And they go, what do you mean? I go, well, how much are they going to withhold in taxes? How much is your rent? Do you have an educational loan? Do you have a car loan? How much is your other insurance, health insurance, whatever you've got? How much do you spend on food? How much is light and heat? And then finally, how much do you want for entertainment? And I ask students to be very realistic about that. Oh, I want to go out every night and spend $100 at a bar. That's not realistic. You're not going to do it. But what's realistic? You know, I want to go out to dinner 4 times a month at a nice place, and I want to go out for fast food. You know, put together a realistic budget, then ask yourself, can I do this? What's left? That's the bottom line. So, and I'll give you 2 examples. I've had students come to me and say, can I afford to live on $30,000 a year? Well, if you're in San Francisco, nope, right? You can't live. I had a student who graduated 2 years ago, started a job at $160K with a bachelor's degree in San Francisco, and she was struggling. Okay. Her rent was probably $3,000 a month. She had student loans. It sounds like a ton of money, and in San Francisco, it's not. In Elmira, which is a cruddy, that's where my wife's from, so I'm always joking. There's 2 prisons there. I joke with her about that too. So if a student says, well, I'm going to live back at home with my parents for a couple of years till I get on my feet. I don't have any loans. They gave me a car, so I'm not paying for a car. I'm going to make $30,000. And I'm like, yeah, absolutely. You're going to be rich, right? I mean, you're going to do really well. By the time you move out of your parents' house, and I've had students tell me, I have an aunt who lives in New York City and she's a spare bedroom, whatever. Assess your own needs realistically, because I chose a particularly low number, $30,000. But if you're living in Elmira and you're not paying rent, you're not paying for a car, and you don't have school loans, that's a lot of money, okay? In New York City, in Boston, and Chicago, you can't live. So do the math. Your own math, not my math. Do your own math. So this is where I actually talk about the reason I'm supposed to be talking tonight, 40 minutes into it. What kind of jobs can you get? What kind of careers? So under traditional, you can work in a lab. If you work in industry, you're going to get paid about 20% more. You can go to graduate school, and I'm going to talk a lot about that. You can go to a professional school if you choose to. And things aren't like they used to be. I mean, when I was in college, someone became a physician, they're going to make like $400,000 a year. With insurance companies paying most of the bills, their salaries are capped. You'd have a hard time making $200K as a general practitioner, which sounds like a lot of money, but most physicians graduate from medical school with about $250,000 in debt. So $200K a year sounds like a ton of money, but not when you're given 30,000 of it or 50,000 of it to pay back your loans or whatever the number is. You can be unemployed. I know lots of people who do that, and it's fun for a very short period of time, and then you get hungry. So don't do that. Don't aspire to do that. It is a traditional path, but don't do it. Non-traditional, go to law school. I saw an advertisement in the back of a science magazine once where a law firm in New York City wanted a scientist to help them with patent law, and they would pay you. This was back in 1990, I think. They would pay you $60,000 a year and your tuition while you get a law degree, as long as you commit to staying there and help them with patent law. That's a sweet deal. You could work for a publisher. There's actually a publisher in Rochester that does scientific stuff. SSRN. They're part of Elsevier. I've been to their place. Really cool offices. Old building on University Avenue in the city with really high ceilings and wooden floors that are probably 200 years old. Really cool place. You can work for a publisher. You could work for lawyers as their biotech experts. The biotechnology field and the pharmaceutical field, and they're always industry companies are always applying for patents, and lawyers don't know science. They need someone to help them out. So even with a bachelor's degree in biotech, you could certainly do that. You could, if you had the stomach for it, you could work for legislators as a science advisor. There's, with advances in biotechnology, there are all sorts of things that need to be considered by legislators, privacy laws, all sorts of stuff, intellectual property laws. So you could do that. You could start a business. And that sounds really sexy. I've done it. If you got a full-time job, it's a nice thing to do. And if you're relying on it to feed yourself, it could be kind of dicey, but you certainly can do it. You can become a consultant. I do consulting work. And if you do, think real hard about your price. I had someone I know got a job as a consultant, and I think the first couple of jobs she had, she was getting paid $25 an hour. And you say to yourself, wow, geez, minimum at the time, minimum wage was like $7. Wow, 25 is really good. Okay, so now you're going to pay about 30% in taxes. You're going to pay 15% in Social Security. If you're self-employed, you pay 14.8 or 15%. You've got to pay for your own health insurance. Whether you do or not, you should be putting money in the bank for retirement. But let's ignore that. What have I just said? Like 70% of it's already committed. And that means you got 30% of $25, which means you've got about minimum wage. So when you're all done, you're making the same as if you worked in McDonald's, and they would pay your health insurance. Okay. So you can be a patent agent. Most people don't know this. With a degree in biotechnology in New York State, you are eligible to sit for the patent bar exam. Bar exams are the exams that lawyers take. They have different components. You can take the patent bar with a bachelor's degree and become what's called a patent agent. You're not a patent attorney, you're a patent agent. And you can get a job as a patent agent working for a company, working for a law firm, working for yourself. I've written a couple of patents. I mean, it's kind of tedious, but it's not impossible. So you could actually do that. And I have a friend who's an attorney. She was a criminal justice major as an undergraduate. An attorney, a practicing attorney, she cannot take the patent bar exam because she didn't have a science degree as an undergraduate. So even attorneys can't take it unless they have a science degree. You can take it with a biotech degree. You can become a nurse. A lot of students have gone to the U of R for their accelerated nursing program. So for about, I can't remember the number, $70,000, $75,000, and they don't offer financial aid, you can become a nurse. You could be a technical or grant writer. There are actually people who do that by themselves, or they work for companies. Locally, there's a few 5-person companies that do that. With your background, you could do that. You could become a genetic counselor, but you'd have to get an MS degree. You could become a physician assistant, but you'd have to get an MS degree. And both of those mean you're paying more tuition and spending more time in school. You could be a salesperson. And everybody I know who's in sales makes more money than me, okay? Like it or don't, you're going to make money if you're good at it. You could work on regulatory issues at universities. We have a biosafety committee. We have an animal welfare committee. Companies locally, there's a biotech company. I'm on their biosafety committee. They have to have one by law. And then this very last one I had never heard of until relatively, the second to last. You can become a professional project, that looks redundant, a project management professional. Okay, that's what, management. You got to be certified, and you have to take a couple classes to do it, but it's not impossible. My son-in-law is one. He's got a bachelor's degree. He's a certified PMP, and again, he makes more money than me because he works in industry, and that's an extremely valuable certification. And anybody can do it. You just got to, there are requirements. You take like 2 classes and get some experience, and you can take the exam. And finally, you could pursue what you're interested in. You could be a dancer. You're not going to eat. You're not going to make a lot of money. You're going to be happy for a short period of time. And then you're probably going to join the ranks of the unemployed. Okay. But in any case, I'm trying to keep it a little bit light.
What
right.
exactly is a PMP?
Look it up. No, really, it's a project management professional. It's someone who has a degree in anything, turns out. And then you've met the requirements, which means you got to take a couple classes in project management. And I think it might only be 2. And you have to have some number of hours managing projects. And you could be kind of funny about that. I mean, my research laboratory is project management, so I probably have the experience. And then you take a written exam, and if you pass it, you get a certification called, you are called a project management professional. And so my son-in-law gets paid a lot of money. He has a degree in MIS, which is a computer degree from business schools, management information science. And he worked in the oil and gas exploration industry where he was managing $10 million projects and $20 million projects. He got paid a ton of money to do it. Okay. So I think that's really cool. I actually thought about doing it myself. I just don't think I could take another college course. It would kill me. Okay. Been there, done that. I'm on the other side of the lectern now. Any other questions? Does this sound like a lecture? Are you going to be disappointed when I give you the quiz at the end? That's what I do. No, I'm kidding. There won't be a quiz. And at this point, I really do wish this was vodka.
Are we editing that out or no?
No, you can say that. It's perfectly okay. You can leave it in. It's perfectly okay. Only because it isn't vodka. So how many of you, and I don't know I can't see you all at once, but I'll assume that some of you are thinking about graduate school. And I
know I am.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with graduate school. I told you, my second slide, I'm here to give you information, not to talk you into or out of anything. So I want to talk a little bit about graduate school. And this comes under the heading of when I said you could open a business, and in parentheses, I said, with your eyes wide open. That's what I want you to see right here. So graduate school. I had a third-year student come to me a couple years ago. Man, I'd love to get a PhD, but I'm tapped. I can't borrow another penny. And I said, you don't pay tuition in graduate school. And it was like a revelation. You don't pay tuition in a PhD program. In a master's program, you likely will, but in a PhD program, you don't. In fact, they pay you. And currently it's around $30K. It's a little more. We have a student who graduated last spring who's at Cornell now. She's getting $37K. Let's put that in perspective. That's almost twice what my first faculty position paid, okay, as a graduate student. And then people say things like, oh my gosh, but it's 5 years of my life. I know they buy cars, they get married, you're living, you're not in prison, you're in graduate school. So you can still do stuff. It's not like you can't, okay? But the reality is there are fewer jobs for people with higher levels of education. And I'll give you an example. In a research laboratory at the University of Rochester, and I use them as an example a couple times now for 2 reasons. I was on the faculty there and I ran a research laboratory. And generally, let's pick a typical research laboratory. You got 1 PhD running it, 2 or 3 technicians with bachelor's degree. That's a 1-to-3 ratio. That means if you have a PhD, there's only 1 job opportunity. If you have a bachelor's degree, there's 3. Okay. So that 3-to-5 is pretty accurate. People say, I want to get a PhD so I can do my own thing and be autonomous. Never, ever. If you're the CEO of a company, the shareholders are telling you what to do. If you're the president of a university, the board of trustees is telling you what to do. If you're a regular faculty member, the granting agency that's paying you is telling you what to do. You never have true autonomy pretty much ever, okay? So and it's fine. Everybody works for somebody and that's perfectly okay. But if your goal is to be, I'm going to be my own boss, I don't know anyone who is, okay? On the other hand, advanced degrees open doors. I do some really cool stuff. I mean, I was the chair of a grant review committee for the Department of Defense, for God's sake. If you had asked me that when I was in college, I would have said no way. I do a fair bit of consulting with attorneys in criminal cases. I love it. It's fun. Some of it's kind of disgusting because of the crimes, but it's really cool. And I really get the satisfaction of helping people do stuff they can't do on their own. And if I didn't have a PhD, I couldn't do that. So I'm not going to list it all, but I've done some really good stuff that people wouldn't have phoned me and said, could you do this if I didn't have a PhD? How much can you make? And this is with different degrees, master's degrees, professional degrees, PhDs. These are dollars over here, and you can make more money typically with advanced degrees. I would love to see error bars on this because I'm going to guess this and this are pretty much the same if they had error bars. So someone who's really good with a bachelor's degree working in industry is going to make more than a professor. My bioinformatics graduates with a bachelor's degree start in jobs making more than we pay assistant professors at RIT. Okay. Now that's a little different, but nevertheless, that's a fact. So think about that. If you're going to invest 5 years of your life, which, that's a little bit of a misleading statement because you're going to live your life, you're going to do stuff, but nevertheless, it's 5 to 7 year commitment. Is it worth it? And that's very personal. So I actually downloaded this today from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. If you don't know about it, it's a website you could spend your career just exploring it. They have so much information. So I looked up biological technician. Hold on. Did somebody say something in chat that I should know about? Was there a question?
Yes, there was a question.
Okay, let me look. I have a 55-inch TV in front of me and I can't fit everything on the screen. Yeah, so the question is, and it's Jacob again, thank you. You say there are less jobs for those with higher degrees. Are there a lot of unemployed people with, we'll get there. Jacob, you're going to be shocked. And it depends what you call unemployed. I'm going to include underemployed, and the number is beyond shocking, okay? So I'll get there, though, and I won't forget. I have a slide for it. So this is what it says at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The median pay last year was 45, or call it 46K. That's pretty darn good, okay? Now, that's the median pay across the United States from Ames, Iowa to San Francisco and everything on the East Coast. With a bachelor's degree, the job outlook, it's actually growing. And there's more and more jobs for people with your degree than ever before. Okay, that's a great thing. And then if you look down here, I picked a few out. These are the kind of salaries you can get working in different venues with your degree. So for the government, you're not going to get rich. Working at companies, you're going to get more. And you can see things here. Remember I said about 20% more. So what's 20% of 45 is $9,000. It's a little less than that here, but it's still, you get more if you work at a company. These are dependent variables. Got to sound like a scientist. Where you're going to live makes a difference. Whether you work at industry or academia makes a difference. Your job title makes a difference. I had students graduate with a bioinformatics degree who have jobs called bioinformaticist, and students with the same degree have jobs called software engineer, and they make more money as software engineers. So keep an eye on that as well. And then experience. You can't discount experience. It's huge. Unpleasant truths. I already told you. The first couple of years out, your experience is worth more than your degree. That's pretty much invariable. Management jobs require experience. We used to have a combined BS in biotechnology and MBA. And I knew 2 or 3 students who went through it and they got a job and they came back to me a year later and said, I was misled. I thought I could walk into a management position. And I said, of course you can't. You have to have experience. And sure enough, 2 years later, they came to me and said, oh my gosh, I was fast-tracked and now I'm the boss. So you got to have experience. I already said, there's more jobs for people with BS and MS degrees than PhDs. You will make more money in a professional career, but you're going to pay more money to get there. Most in the United States, the average debt for a physician with an MD is $250,000. Okay. So now take your $200K a year and offset it with your loan payments and your health insurance and everything else. And turns out $200K isn't what it used to be. And then you have to consider lost income. And this is where it gets funky. So let's say I'm going to make numbers up. Let's say you get a job or you go to get a PhD and they pay you $30K a year and you could have made 51 in industry. That means every year you're losing $21,000 times 5 years. That's 100K you didn't make. Okay. That's what I mean when I say lost income. And when you graduate with your PhD, you're the low person wherever you go. So if you've been working for 5 years somewhere, chances are you've climbed the career ladder a little bit. When you get your PhD after 5 years, you're the new person. Okay. Again, I'm just throwing information at you. Do you know about the imposter syndrome? Have you guys ever heard of that? Many PhDs, and I did it myself. You get your PhD and you think, oh my God, I know everything, right? I'm so cool. And then you get your first position. Wow, geez, I don't know anything. Why did they even give me this job? Because I had a PhD, but I had no experience whatsoever. And, that all changed. Well, what changes is you realize you don't know anything instead of thinking you do. So PhDs, so a lot of them get employed. Absolutely. Some go back for further study. Some work and study. Some are unemployed. I tell you, that's nice for a couple of weeks, but, it gets old. And then and this was in the UK, but, still. So what kind of jobs do they get? Well, about 31% are doing science. With PhDs in science, 31% are doing science. Some of them become high school teachers. Some get involved with other stuff. Okay, now, this always worries me. I don't know what that always worries me. I had 2 daughters, and, one of them would get home at 2 a.m. I go, where were you? Well, we went out to dinner, and then we went to a movie, and, and stuff. And it's the stuff that really drove me nuts as a dad. Okay, so the other, I don't know what that means. I really don't. Life of crime. And then there are these perpetual postdocs, and Jacob asked about this. There is an increase in the number of postdocs every year, and that's because, and let me see if I have it. Yeah, never mind. I thought I had it. I do, actually. It's in words on one of my final slides. In the past 20 years or so, less than 20% of PhDs in the life sciences got academic jobs. Okay. And what let me change what I said. Tenure track academic jobs, like professors. They might be instructors, which are non-tenure track. They might be adjuncts, which are non-tenure track. There might be all sorts of things, but they didn't get tenure track positions 80% of the time. So there's a pileup of postdocs. There's just not a lot of jobs. So Jacob, that addresses it. That addresses your question, I think. If I'm wrong, let me know. And then it's interesting too. I've talked to students who say things like, I forgot to put the closing quote there. Things like, oh, I'm going to get my degree in 4 years, then I'm going to get a PhD in 5 years, then I'll do a 2-year postdoc, and then I'm going to get a job for 3 years, then I'm going to have a baby, whatever. A nonlinear path is perfectly okay. I had a bioinformatics student who was struggling, a male student, and that shouldn't matter, but it may, in my office crying like a baby because he had to change majors from bioinformatics to biotech. And I said, it just wasn't right for you. That's nothing to get upset about. You realize that your plan was uninformed. I mean, you come out of high school, you don't know anything about careers. You don't know anything about college. You can put down a plan and it may fail. And it's not that you're a failure. It's just you didn't know when you were going into it. I had a student who was a Toby, was a bioinformatics major for 3 years, took a technical writing course and changed his major and ended up going to law school. I mean, and he never anticipated that until he took a course and went, oh my gosh, this is pretty cool stuff. So a nonlinear path is okay. Yeah, Jacob, it's reality. Jacob left something in the chat, said it's shocking. It's reality. So I just want to say a nonlinear path is perfectly okay. It really is. I mean, whatever you choose to do, if you don't meet your own expectations, then recalibrate your expectations. You're not a loser unless you're sitting in a prison in Elmira, okay? But otherwise, I know lots of people. When I worked at a medical center, I was absolutely shocked at the number of physicians who became physicians for reasons I didn't expect. My mom wanted me to be a doctor. I got a job for 2 years, and it turns out I was lousy at it, so I went to medical school. Maybe 10% said I had a passion for helping people, so I went to medical school. The other 90% did something that I wouldn't have expected. So nonlinear paths are perfectly okay. So what do we do with these PhDs? And this shows, I say don't lose sight of the lost income and lost opportunities. What are they doing? Look at the postdoc, the white line here. We got a pile of postdocs. Tenure track positions are actually going down. Universities, and RIT is one of them, have discovered that it's cheaper to hire part-time people than it is to invest in somebody's career with a tenure track position. It's happening all over the country. From your perspective, you're still getting a PhD teaching your courses, but it's not someone that the university is willing to invest in a lifetime career. That's what that red line means. And then these things, PhDs awarded in social sciences, and there's a lot of, the bottom line is, a lot of PhDs in the life sciences. That's this red line, and it's going up. So how about earning potential? It's okay, right? I mean, it's okay. In any career, people can make a lot of money. But if you look at satisfaction with their income, with a PhD and without, I mean, those are almost superimposable, right? I mean, the satisfied number, there's a few more here, but it's probably within measuring error. Again, I sound negative. I'm not trying to talk you out of anything. Jacob said he was shocked. These are the facts. So what's wrong with this is where I get to stand on a soapbox. What's wrong with our PhD programs? We train our students to be like us. I taught my students how to write grants, how to write papers, how to review papers, etc. I didn't teach them about good laboratory practices or good manufacturing practices. About 20 years ago, my department head and I did a survey of the biotech industry in New York State. We got a grant to do that. And when the respondents came back from companies that say, your students don't know anything about GLP, we had to look that up. We didn't even know what it meant. That's how removed we were from that world, the industry world. We don't train our students about those stuff. We have relaxed notebook guidelines. In most companies, your notebook stays in a safe overnight. So when the company applies for a patent, they can say, we had full control of our data the entire time that person worked here. We don't have equipment and reagent validation. At companies, if you're using a water bath, every half hour you measure the temperature and you record it on a chart. So that when you get an experimental result, you can say, yeah, my water bath was at 37 degrees. I know it because every 30 minutes I checked it. And you don't get any training in laboratory economics. I mean, you work in somebody's lab. If I asked you at the end of the week, how much did you spend in consumables? How many pipette tips did you throw away? How many Eppendorf tubes, et cetera? You're going to say, I have no clue. I know people that get jobs at companies and they propose projects to their superiors. And they say, this is going to cost X number of dollars in consumables. It's going to require Y number of person hours to complete. It's much more serious in industry. That's why you get paid more. And this is where it said less than 20% of the science PhDs awarded over the past 20 years have tenure track academic positions. So if you want a PhD, great. Do it with your eyes wide open. I know a lot of my former students got PhDs, and that's spectacular. That's really great, but know what you're getting into. If you think you're going to be rich and famous, you're going to be neither, okay? Unless you're special, and that happens in every field, right? You might do something that's extraordinary. I was talking yesterday in one of my classes about reading papers, and I tend to look at where the people are from, what academic institutions. Does anybody know who discovered the ability of RNA to act as a catalyst? RNA enzymes exist. I mean, when I was in school, they said enzymes are made of protein. Well, now they're made of always, but now we know they're made of either protein or RNA. Do you know who discovered that?
Wasn't it a physicist at a UC school? Or am I thinking of something else?
No, it was absolutely UC. It was a guy named Tom Check at University of Colorado, I think Boulder. If you ask,
University of California, so I don't.
Oh, the other UC. Sorry, UCO, not UCA. And if you asked me to list, in my opinion, the top 100 schools in the United States, Colorado's not on it. Okay, and yet he got a PhD. He got a PhD, of course. He won a Nobel Prize for his work. So you can be great. You can always be great, no matter what you do and where you are. But that's the exception. I don't know this for a fact, but he may be the only one in the University of Colorado system who ever got a Nobel Prize. I don't know that's true, but certainly Harvard has more than they do, okay? So where are you going to go with this? Well, there's all sorts of stuff you can do. And this is kind of a roadmap, but there's, you can do research jobs, you can do any number of things in academia and outside. And this says a faculty job is an alternative career. Do you know why it says that? I mean, don't read it. Do you know why it says that? I've already told you. Because less than 20% of PhDs get tenure track faculty positions. That's why it's an alternative. 80% do something else, okay? So there's a lot of things you can do. You're never, ever relegated to standing at a lab bench doing research. And if you ever doubt that, as you're thinking about your own career, talk to me outside of this presentation, okay? I've had students come to me and say, what can I do? I hate working at a lab bench. And then we talk about it and they end up doing something else. And then 5 years later, they write to me and say, wow, this is pretty cool. Remind me, well, don't remind me. I'll try to remember to tell you about my student from UC San Diego. I told you she's my favorite student because she invited me to stay in this really ritzy. So I'm throwing down the gauntlet. If you want to take her position as my favorite, once you're out there doing something, invite me to California to stay in a really expensive place. So what do you do? Consider your opportunities. Don't say, oh God, I picked this degree, I'm going to be working at a lab bench my whole life. It's not true. It's just not true. Always present yourself in the best possible light. Don't ever meet someone at a networking event. I'll tell you, I've read job applications and, inevitably we'll ask, so why are you applying for this job? Oh, my boss is a jerk. It really sucks where I work. No one wants to ever hear that, ever. We don't want people like that. Present yourself in the best light. Why are you applying for this job? Well, I'm looking for a career advancement, and where I am, I don't feel that I have those opportunities. Or I realized after working there for 3 or 4 years that there's probably a better fit out there because I don't get to use my creativity as much as I'd hope, or something positive. Always establish networks, always. Talk to everybody. Collect information from students who are getting their PhDs, students who got their PhDs, students who got jobs without getting PhDs. Think about your salary requirements. What do you need? Well, I'm going to make this up. I've got $250,000 in student debt. I need a good salary. I'm not going to be able to buy groceries. Okay. Think about your realistic needs and your desires. And that's the thing I mentioned earlier. You're not going to live like a monastic lifestyle. You want to be able to go out. Well, you can't now, but when you can, you want to go to a movie or a Broadway show, or you want to be able to do stuff. And it's okay to list that. If you say, well, the first year I want to buy $100,000 in gold jewelry, that's not realistic. But to say I'm wearing gold jewelry, that's not a sexist thing. But that's not to say you can't schedule that in your budget. You should be realistic. And then pursue your passions. So 20 years ago, I used to tell students, find something you're passionate in, do it for a living, and you'll never work a day in your life, right? And that's total BS. If you graduate with significant debt, you got to find a way to pay it back and be happy. If you want to dance, do it in a community group, do it after work at night, do it in a club, do something. But you really need to find a way to exploit the money you've invested in your education and the work you've put into it. Ignoring the money, you guys, to do well at RIT, you got to work hard. And you want to get a return on that investment of that hard work. So think real hard about your careers and do it from day one. All right, I have a couple minutes. I have one more slide. Anybody have any questions? Jacob, you must have a question. Or Thomas, you've been good with questions. Any questions? Sarah, you're on my screen. I can only see 3 of you. Do you have any questions?
I actually do. What are some good networking events outside of like RIT?
Yeah. So in Western New York, which includes Buffalo, there's a thing called MedTech, and it's not all about med techs. It's about all things biological. Okay. So there's an organization, as a student, you can probably join it for $10 a year or something. They have breakfast, lunches, evening meetings, that sort of thing. Get involved with that. Volunteer at the museum and science center, and get involved with the scientists, not, the people walking through the door showing their kids things, but the scientists who actually plan the exhibits. Get involved with that. It's a good opportunity to network. In bioinformatics, I tell students, and it applies to you all as well, there's a local organization who just changed their name. It used to be Digital Rochester. Might be called Tech Rochester now. It's a really neat organization. It started out back when the big telephone companies were broken up by the FCC, and a lot of people lost their job. So they started to hang out in bars and pass around business cards. This is my name. If you got an opening, I'd love to take it. And it's grown into an organization that in Rochester has about 3,000 members. And once a month, they have a networking event that's either free or literally costs $2. And they often provide food and alcohol. Okay. And I've been to those and they're great. And I met people so I had a real reason. I was responsible for finding co-op opportunities for bioinformatics students. So I had a real reason to go there besides the beer and the food, but it's great and it's cheap. And they're at least once a year, they do an event on RIT's campus. So as a non-member, it might be $3, and as a member, it's $2. So go. Okay. Sarah, find opportunities like that. Take advantage of them. Anybody else have any questions?
I actually have a little addition to that.
Yeah.
There's a conference that happens on a yearly basis called Grow NY.
Yeah.
And it's where a bunch of agriculturally centered things happen.
Can I just interject?
Yeah, of course.
Who cares? Okay, never mind. I don't care about plants, but okay, go ahead.
But there's just a lot of really cool things that are happening out there.
Yeah.
And it's kind of neat to go up to these stations and just say like, I am a biologist and I could add this type of thing to your company, where like this one person was working on like the flavor profile of grapes.
Yep.
To like make wine and bread and weird
right.
things.
So I joked and said I don't care about plants. Turns out worldwide, agriculture is the biggest industry there is, right? And it's becoming more and more biotechnology. It used to be, you fertilize your water and you get what you get. Nowadays, we can use CRISPR. We can do all sorts of things to make plants do what we want them to do, which is actually the definition of biotechnology. It's about making living things do the things we want them to do, unless they're cats, and then they don't ever. But anyways, so absolutely, any organization like that, take advantage of opportunities because you never know. You might go there and meet someone whose sister-in-law is a manager at some pharma company and offers you a huge job. So always take advantage. So Shreya said in the chat, talked about nonlinear tracks. That's what I feel about nonlinear tracks. I'm a mechanical engineer major interested in healthcare. You bet. Absolutely. People are doing that all the time. And then Jacob, do the majority of people who obtain a PhD want to become a professor? I don't know if I would say that, but a lot of them do. And we train them to be professors. So I don't know if they want to become one or if they think that's the default. And do recent projections have professor jobs going down? Yes, absolutely. That was on one of the graphs that was that was one of the lines that was going downward. So yes, there's no change in that. Any other questions? I do want to share, we're running out of time, but I want to share one last thing with you. Any other questions before I do? So I've been asked a lot of times, how important is a letter? How important is it to get to know someone who's going to write a letter of recommendation? This is the anatomy of a letter. The first paragraph is some version of it's a pleasure to write this letter in support of their application for a job or graduate school or whatever. And then I use different words. It's an extreme pleasure. It's an uncommon pleasure, depending on the student. And then in that first paragraph, how do I know this person? And if I said was in one class and got an A, right away they're just going to put that letter down and they're not going to read it because that's not very meaningful. Then I always say I met this person in a class because that's what we do. And I talk about what made that person special. Did a great job, tough class, helped their fellow student, whatever. And then I end with a summary with a recommendation. And now, if I couldn't recommend someone, I would have said no when I was asked to do it. But the strength of my recommendation, I end with, I strongly recommend, or I enthusiastically recommend, or I enthusiastically recommend that you admit her without reservations. That's the strongest thing I could say. When I read letters from students who apply to our master's program, I often skip to the very last paragraph because that's where you read stuff like that. And if someone said, you know, she was a good student and she'd do well in your program, you know, that's equivalent to being damned by faint praise. Okay, so I try to make my letters meaningful, but this is pretty much what a letter looks like. So why is it important to you today? Get to know the professors, get to know people so they can write a meaningful letter and not simply say, he took one class from me and got an A, so he's a good student. There's lots of good students. That letter doesn't mean anything. All right, I wanted to do that just so you can start laying the foundation now. All right, any other questions?
It's not a question, but going back to what Paul was saying and just Dr. Skuse's broad point is, if you do go to conferences,
Yeah.
you go make a point of talking to the people who are at their booths with no one else talking to them. I have literally gotten an internship because I made a point of going around a conference and talking to people who no one else is like giving the time of day.
No, you're right. And so one of the things that book, that Networking for Nerds, points out is that a lot of scientists are introverted. That's why you like to work in a lab by yourself, you know, late at night. Get over yourself. If you want to be successful, I mean, you don't have to go and be somebody's best friend, but you can shake a hand and give them a business card and say, what do you guys do? Right? And Spencer, you're absolutely right. If someone's got 100 people clamoring at their booth, they're less likely to notice you. But if they're standing there alone, they're dying to talk to somebody. They're going to appreciate that you've taken the time to do it, and that'll open doors for you. Really will. Any other questions or comments? Anybody? Sebastian, do you know there's someone in the background behind you? Okay, just didn't want anybody to sneak up on you. Okay. Anybody? I'm just going to scroll through everybody. Emily hasn't said a word. Emily, you really here?
Yeah, I'm really here.
Okay. Are you in Rochester or are you at home?
I am at home in Rochester.
I know. Well, no, I mean at RIT or at home?
I'm at home.
Okay. All right. Good. Good. All right. Anybody, last chance. Any questions? Any comments? Everybody's afraid to say, geez, this really is a waste of time because it might come back to haunt you. All right.
All right. Well, thank you so much for doing this with us.
You're absolutely welcome. It's really a pleasure. The reason I do what I do is because I feel very strongly that I'm here for you guys to succeed. So anything I can do to help that, I'm happy to do it.
Yeah, we really appreciate it.
Well, no problem. I may go pour myself a glass of vodka. No, I'm not gonna.
Not a bad idea.
I know. All right. All right. And
words.
What did you say, Spencer?
Glass, strong choice of words.
Yes, that's right. So I'm going to reiterate. I'm going to stop, but I'm going to reiterate something I said earlier. Contact me if you have any questions, if you want to talk about it, if you want advice, if it's like, what should I do about starting my own network? Don't hesitate to ask. Okay. I'm happy to field any questions you have.
We'll make sure to include your email in our follow-up email.
Yep, please. And, if you just Google me at RIT, you're going to get my email. But feel free to ask. Even a lot of you have never been my students before. Doesn't matter. You're an RIT student. I'm happy to help. Okay?
Speaking of which, take this man's ethics class, his undergraduate ethics class. It's fantastic.
The one in the spring.
Say that.
The one in the spring. I'm teaching one now.
Science and the law.
Yeah,
Science
I know.
and law, I have not taken that, but I hear that's also fantastic.
Yeah, Thomas, I'm so mad we couldn't teach it this year because we couldn't bring Helen back.
Yeah.
Really upset about that.
No outside lecturers at all, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And I can't do it without her. She's the expert on the law. And we have to tease each other in class or it just doesn't have the same chemistry.
Exactly.
I actually saw her a few weeks ago. We got together with her husband and my wife and had a nice time, actually. It was fun. All right. Well, anyways, don't hesitate to contact me. I invite you all to do it. And you're not asking for a favor. It's what I do. So don't hesitate. All right. I'll see y'all. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.
Good
Bye.
night.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. You're welcome.